This is our Ponty reading group. We are continuing our reading of The Structure of Behavior, Chapter 3, picking up from page 179 of the translation. So we're still on the human order, the third of these three orders of reality or orders of discourse that Ponty is setting out here, the physical, vital, and human orders. So the last little bit that maybe the two things to go over are, first, what is specific to the human order in relation to the vital order is precisely this for itself character of the human order. So in the case of studying animal behavior, we can identify this sort of melodic structure of the behavior, the way everything is connected to, different aspects of the behavior are sort of motivated by other aspects, or how there's this overall structure to the behavior, and it's not just a sort of pattern of association or conditioning, like the way that the reflex theory would present that, and that Merleau-Ponty has criticized throughout the rest of the book. But that structure or pattern of behavior is something that is only given explicitly to an external observer watching the animal's behavior. The animal itself doesn't sort of have that structure available to it as something that it's explicitly aware of. It just acts in various ways, but it doesn't necessarily have like an awareness of the pattern of its behavior. Whereas in the case of humans, so it's not so of course many things that we do involve structures and patterns of behavior that we are not aware of, but at the same time, we do have some awareness of something, some sort of pattern or structure of our behavior, and that awareness is itself it contributes to shaping that behavior. So like your understanding of yourself as a parent, for example, like you sort of part of so in the case of I don't know, dogs or birds or monkeys or whatever, there are certain behaviors that they engage in raising their offspring, but they don't have like a sort of awareness of themselves as parents. Whereas in the case of humans, we of course also have behavior of taking care of our offspring, but we also have this awareness of ourselves as parents, and we use that awareness to guide our behavior, with varying degrees of success in terms of like what kinds of behavior are appropriate for a parent, or what things should I not do because I'm a parent, etc. And so that awareness of this sort of pattern or structure contributes to shaping the behavior sort of from inside. It's not just something that an external observer can sort of sorry, just laughing about this comment about the cat. So like in the case of the monkeys or the birds or whatever, it's the human observer that can study what is the pattern of parenting behavior in this type of animal, and it's this sort of external relationship. Whereas in the case of humans, you can also do that kind of study of parenting behavior, but part of what makes up that pattern of parenting behavior is precisely the way that the parents themselves understand what it is to be a parent. And so there's this sort of for itself, or this sort of internal nature of the pattern in the case of the human order that is not present at the vital order. And then the next bit is like he talked a little bit about psychoanalysis, only a couple pages, but it's I mean, of course, this was written in the 1930s, and so psychoanalysis was like sort of omnipresent in European cultural life. So like the question here is, to what extent does the criticism of causal explanations or causal explanations of mental life in previous parts of the book, to what extent does that apply to psychoanalysis as well? Because the way Freud talks about the unconscious and the different drives and so on that he identifies, he uses causal language to express what he's talking about. So we'll say like, this behavior is caused by this drive, or the interaction of these two drives or whatever. So he's expressing the patterns or structure of human behavior in terms of causes, as opposed to this sort of form or melodic structure that Merleau-Ponty has identified. There's a sort of superficially at least, there's a conflict between these two ways of describing behavior or explaining behavior. And then the question is that only superficial? Is there some more sophisticated way of understanding psychoanalysis that would show how they're compatible, or is there a sort of real fundamental conflict between these two different forms of explanation? And so I think what Merleau-Ponty wants to do is to sort of reinterpret psychoanalysis, sort of redescribe some of the things that Freud talks about in terms that allow it, that sort of make it compatible with his melodic or form account of mental life, so that so something like a drive is not to be understood as this kind of force in a hard to understand psychic realm that is not identical with the biological existence of the human being. So we would instead see these, descriptions of drives and complexes and the like as a kind of way of describing patterns of behavior and of mental life in general. But yeah, he only gives us, sort of sketches of what that might look like. Obviously, this is not a book that's like about psychoanalysis. It's not a sort of sustained engagement with psychoanalysis. But yeah, it'd be interesting to. I know there's been some secondary literature about like relationships between phenomenology and psychoanalysis, but that's not something I know much about. Okay, so let's pick up. Yeah, I think we stopped like sort of in the middle of the Freud bit, so we can pick up from the top of 179 and continue on that. If Angus, you'd like to read?
Yeah, I can read. I think we actually stopped mid-paragraph on 179.
Yeah, I think we're right at the top. Yeah.
Okay. The catastrophic attitude, or that of the dreamer, is not bound up with historical antecedents, which would explicate their true meaning. At that moment, the subject lives after the manner of children, who are guided by the immediate feeling of the permitted or the forbidden, without looking for the meaning of the prohibitions. Thus, the pretended unconsciousness of the complex is reduced to the ambivalence of immediate consciousness. The regression of the dream, the efficacy of a complex acquired in the past, and finally, the unconsciousness of the repressed only manifest the return to a primitive manner of organizing conduct, a yielding of the more complex structures, and a withdrawal toward more facile ones. But then, mental functioning, as Freud has described it, the conflicts of force, and the energetic mechanisms which he imagined, would represent in a very approximative way, moreover, only fragmentary behavior, that is, behavior which is pathological. The possibility of constructing a causal explanation of behavior is exactly proportional to the inadequacy of the structurations accomplished by the subject. The work of Freud constitutes not a tableau of human existence, but a tableau of anomalies, however frequent they may be, along with mechanisms of compensation, sublimation, and transfer, which presuppose the same energic metaphors, and which are thus the solutions of the sick. A true development, a transformation of human existence would be possible. To the extent that sublimation is only a derivation of unemployed biological forces, new activity must conserve the fluctuating character and the lability characteristic of non-integrated behavior. In cases in which sublimation and transfer have succeeded, on the contrary, it is because vital energies are no longer the motor forces of behavior. They have been really integrated into a new whole and eliminated as biological forces. From this, we see that it should be possible and necessary to distinguish cases in which Freudian mechanisms function from others in which they have been transcended. There would be people whose whole conduct is explicable by the history of the libido, and all of whose acts would be related only to the universe of biology. Through the human world, which they do not see, they aim at vital objects, just as others, prisoners of a parental complex, believe they, quote, are marrying, unquote, when in reality they are seeking a maternal protection. This is because the reorganization, the new birth of the adult or the man, is accomplished in them in word and not in reality. Others, by mechanisms of sublimation properly so called, would believe they were transcending the vital and social dialectic and would be able only to distract themselves from it. There is a vague love which attaches itself to the first object which it accidentally encounters. There's an art and a religion the whole meaning of which is to compensate in a virtual world for real failures or constraints. There is finally, as Nietzsche said, an adherence to values of sacrifice, which is only a form of vital impotence and of quote unquote impoverished life. These pseudo solutions are recognizable from the fact that the being of the person never coincides with what he says, what he thinks, or even what he does. False art, false sanctity, and false love, which seek, like the seminary companions of Julien Sorel, to quote, perform significant acts, unquote, give to human life only a borrowed significance, effect only an ideal transformation, a flight into transcendent ideas. But there are other men capable of integrating into their existence by unifying it what in the preceding ones was only ideological pretext, and these would be truly men. With respect to them, the causal explanations of Freud would always be anecdotal. They would account only for the most external aspects of a true love, just as, according to Freud himself, physiological explanations do not exhaust the content of a dream. Mental actions would have their own proper meaning and their own internal laws. So this perspective on Freud is obviously very much in keeping with the argument developed so far in the book, which is that except in cases where something has gone wrong, causal explanation is insufficient for explaining, I guess, psychological phenomena in a broad sense. And so, just like he's talked a couple of times about how simple causal explanations only apply when something in the animal being studied has kind of broken down. So similarly, Freudian causal explanation of psychic forces can really only be brought to bear where there hasn't been this integration into a larger structure of these kind of localized vital impulses, which in pathology, I guess, haven't been integrated into the global whole. Something kind of off-putting to me about this page or so. One of the things that I like about Freud is this idea that pathology and normalcy differ in degree. So rather than being a kind of difference in kind, I don't know if we could say Merleau-Ponty is saying there's a difference in kind, but there is a kind of, I don't know, threshold of assimilation, I guess, beyond which there is no pathology in mental life, I suppose, for Merleau-Ponty, at least here, which I guess does away with that, the idea of continuity in Freud.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I think he wants to sort of connect this with some of what he's talked about in relation to or like using Goldstein's work about how these sorts of behaviors that are identified in the these patients who have undergone brain injuries are themselves pathological phenomena. So you can't just sort of apply what you discover in the case of these pathological cases to the case of quote unquote normal behavior. And I think he's making a similar type of argument here in relation to Freud that some of these pathological behaviors that Freud studies. Yeah, there's the so he's correct in identifying certain structures of that behavior and so on, but that doesn't mean that this exact structure is also present in the normal case or the case of non-pathological behavior. So it's like I guess an argument that we can't generalize from the pathological case to the non-pathological case.
I remember in Individuation, Volume 1, there was some part, I think, in the Individual Psychic Collective section where Simondon talks about the integration of something like previous iterations of a personality or previous forms of a personality into a sort of successful integration into a whole, which sounds very similar to what Merleau-Ponty is saying here. And kind of makes me want to see this like the form of behavior in Simondonian terms as a whole that is signified and kind of includes all of the disparate pre-individual terms that kind of go into it without reduction.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, sorry, kind of multitasking here. Yeah, I think we can probably go on to the next bit. Sorry, where did we end exactly? What was the last bit we read?
Uh, we read, or we're starting at, but neither the psychological with respect to the vital.
Okay, yeah, so I can read this bit. But neither the psychological with respect to the vital nor the rational, spirituel, with respect to the psychological can be treated as substances or as new worlds. The relation of each order to the higher order is that of the partial to the total. A normal man is not a body bearing certain autonomous instincts joined to a, quote, psychological life, unquote, defined by certain characteristic processes, pleasure and pain, emotion, association of ideas, and surmounted with a mind which would unfold its proper acts over this infrastructure. The advent of higher orders, to the extent that they are accomplished, eliminate the autonomy of the lower orders and give a new signification to the steps which constitute them. This is why we have spoken of a human order rather than of a mental or rational order. The so frequent distinctions of the mental and the somatic has its place. The so frequent distinction of the mental and the somatic has its place in pathology, but cannot serve for the knowledge of normal man, that is, of integrated man, since in him the somatic processes do not unfold in isolation, but are integrated into a cycle of more extensive action. It is not a question of two de facto orders external to each other, but of two types of relations, the second of which integrates the first. The contrast between what is called mental life and what are called bodily phenomena is evident when one has in view the body considered part by part and moment by moment. But as we have seen, biology already refers to the phenomenal body, that is, the center of vital actions which are extended over a segment of time, respond to certain concrete stimulus wholes, and affect the collaboration of the whole organism. These modes of behavior do not even subsist as such in man. Reorganized in its turn in new wholes, vital behavior as such disappears. This is what is signified, for example, by the periodicity and monotony of sexual life in animals, by its constancy and its variations in man. Thus, one cannot speak of the body and of life in general, but only of the animal body and animal life, of the human body and of human life, in the body of the normal subject, if it is not detached from the spatio-temporal cycles of behavior of which it is the support, is not distinct from the psychological. Remarks of the same kind would be possible concerning the notion of mind. We are not defending a mentalism which would distinguish mind and life, or mind and the psychological as two, quote, powers of being, unquote. It is a question of a, quote, functional opposition, unquote, which cannot be transformed into a, quote, substantial opposition, unquote. Mind is not a specific difference which would be added to vital or psychological being in order to constitute a man. Man is not a rational animal. The appearance of reason and mind does not leave intact the sphere of self-enclosed instincts in man. Cognitive disorders which affect the categorical attitude are expressed by a loss of sexual initiatives. The alteration of higher functions reaches as far as the so-called instinctive structures. The ablation of the higher centers entails death, although decerebrate animals can subsist after a fashion. Quote, if man had the senses of an animal, he would not have reason, unquote. Man can never be an animal. His life is always more or less integrated than that of an animal. But if the alleged instincts of man do not exist apart from the mental dialectic, correlatively, this dialectic is not conceivable outside of the concrete situations in which it is embodied. One does not act with the mind alone. Either mind is nothing, or it constitutes a real and not an ideal transformation of man. Because it is not a new sort of being, but a new form of unity, it cannot stand by itself. Yeah, there's a couple of things here that are sort of worth noting. One is just a little translation point that yeah, I'll have to check what the French sentence here is, but they have the word rational followed by spirituel in parentheses here. So that's the translation is that's what rational is the translation of, and that's a bit of a strange translation, or at least it seems to be just from what is given here, because the more sort of straightforward translation would be spiritual as opposed to rational. But yeah, I'd have to check the whole sentence to see if there's a reason for that. But yeah, just flagging that. Also, could someone look up notes 108 and 109 that are a little on the next page, a little bit lower, which unfortunately in this translation are put as endnotes. I hate. Um, um, but yeah, so yeah, you're sort of building on this idea that there's a kind of unity of the sort of quote unquote normal life that that is only split up in pathological cases, so that when we talk about mind and body as being sort of two separate entities, or even sort of factors in the life of a human being, we're already sort of we're already at a sort of pathological level of analysis at that point. Like in our sort of normal existence, we are there's no sort of separation of like a biological or corporeal aspect of our existence, and then a mental aspect that's sort of added on top of it. There's a sort of unified structure of behavior that is not separable into these two elements. And so, like once it's possible to make that separation, in any situation where this kind of separation is possible, that situation is thereby already pathological. So yeah, that's sort of like the bigger picture that he's working with here. So even so like in the cases of psychoanalytic explanations for behavior, this is again like a kind of pathological splitting up of the unified life of a human being into different aspects or functions.
This description of these different orders as having, I can't remember if he has said it here, but he does say it in a couple of places, having a dialectical relation, like the human order being this kind of sublation of the vital order. It makes me wonder what Simondon would think about that. I know that Simondon is keen to distinguish transsection, but individuation generally from dialectics. But sometimes this relation between forms in Merleau-Ponty reminds me a lot of Simondon, or really probably the other way around. And it makes me think again of the relation between individuation and dialectics, which is still not entirely clear to me.
Yeah, I think it wasn't entirely clear to Simondon either. There's like as we talked about in throughout that reading, there are passages where he clearly distinguishes what he's doing from dialectics and criticizes what he considers to be dialectics, and then there's other passages where he describes what he's doing as dialectics. So I think he was it was that footnote 95 in the history of the notion of the individual, that long footnote about the different aspects of the cogito, and it's generally a very dialectical text, even though in other in other passages he criticizes the notion of dialectics as he understands it. I think he had a certain like ambivalence towards dialectics that was never sort of fully resolved. Merleau-Ponty doesn't have the same sort of ambivalence. He generally seems to be pretty happy with describing what he's doing as like a kind of dialectics, or the different types of interrelations of these aspects of human existence are dialectical for him. But yeah, it's there's still a sort of I think maybe the like most straightforwardly dialectical aspect of what is going on in this book, or what has been discussed so far, is that notion of the relation between the explicit and implicit nature of or presentations of a structure or of a form. So we can't sort of make everything explicit at the same time. We can't sort of so like what is characteristic of this melodic structure is precisely that we have to live through it. We can't like taking even the case of a melody in the sort of narrow sense of the term, like an actual musical melody. You can record it on a page. You can write the notes down on a page, and then the structure that is given through time is sort of presented statically on all at the same time on a piece of paper. But this is a sort of representation of the structure rather than like the melodic structure itself. You have to translate from the static notes on the page into this dynamic or temporal structure of the melody. And then even more so in the case of I guess, more complex or more sophisticated structures that are not just so like the pattern of a melody is fairly simple. You can just describe it in terms of intervals going up and down, and then the length of the notes. But if you want to describe like the pattern of your behavior in maintaining a friendship, for example, like all the different ways that you respond to what your friend is doing, like the sort of very complicated interaction of like managing that interact of like managing your relationship with this other person. um of course, you like to sort of there's no equivalent to like writing that down on a page like a musical score that would sort of give this like explicit representation of like all the different factors that go into this temporal pattern of behavior that makes up a friendship. And this is like a general property of these melodic structures is that you can't sort of make them entirely explicit. You can't just sort of depict them in this static representation. But at the same time, it's not the case that there's like something unrepresentable or unexplicitatable, if that's a word, about these forms. That you always can, take some aspect of that melodic structure and become aware of it, make it explicit to yourself. You could, like in the case of the friendship, you could notice that something, like maybe something is going wrong, something is not working the way that you want it to. It's causing friction between you and your friend, and then you can, address that aspect and decide, I want to change the way that our friendship is working, or something like that. So you always can bring some element or some aspect of that melodic structure to your awareness, but you can't sort of grasp the whole thing all at once. And there's this sort of again, this sort of dialectical relationship between the what is explicit and what is implicit in something like a melodic structure, in the sense that there can only be this explicit awareness insofar as it is sort of awareness of something that was implicit previously. So you can't sort of, and this is like his general criticism of pretty much all other psychology or approaches to mental life, is this idea that you could like take these explicit representations and just sort of join them together somehow and then reconstruct mental life out of it. And he thinks this is a mistake and an impossible task. But then at the same time, there's not this like sort of this like obscure like aspect of human existence that could never be represented or never be made explicit, that would be sort of resistant to discursive or conceptual thought. So yeah, they're each aspect, the conceptual or the explicit side of mental life, and this implicit engagement with the world through this dynamic melodic structure. Each of these aspects is dependent on the other, that neither one can be present without the other. And yeah, so this is like the sort of general pattern of the kind of dialectical structures that Merleau-Ponty is using throughout this book.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how this sort of evolves over the course of Merleau-Ponty's thought, especially if we end up reading Phenomenology of Perception. But I know, yeah, especially in his later work, and I'm aware that Visible and the Invisible is literally fragmentary text, but I think that there is, well, I don't know. There's at least an irreducibility of the two terms to each other, and I know Merleau-Ponty has this kind of mysterious notion of hyperdialectic, which almost seems like a kind of perceptual pre-individual, like I don't know, difficult for me to fully understand where we might locate it, because, we do, as he argues in this book, we perceive figures against grounds, and perception is relatively individuated. But that it does seem like, for at least for later Merleau-Ponty, there's a kind of remainder that doesn't get fully picked up in symbolization or in thematization. which, yeah, as we were discussing in the chat, may be a difference between Hegel and Merleau-Ponty.
Yeah, so I think that figure ground distinction again is like quite useful as a sort of example of this kind of explicit and implicit relationship that like yeah when you see this circle on a background a white circle on a black background or whatever the contrast is you might have an explicit awareness of the circle. It might be the circle that is sort of present to your perception, uh, while the background is not just a background in the visual sense, but also is just sort of a background of your awareness. You're not like explicitly aware of the background, in your mind's eye or whatever you want to call it. But of course, in our visual perception, we always can pay attention to the background. Like we can just move our eyes and look at the black background instead of the white circle, even if we're sort of naturally drawn to the circle as opposed to the black background. And I think it's the same. I think it's the same thing in the case of this more general structure of mental life in terms of this explicit and implicit contrast. So anything like whenever we any aspect of our mental life, a thought or a desire or whatever, it always involves some sort of obscure region surrounding the whatever it is that we're explicitly aware of. So there's always this implicit sort of background, um, I don't know, zone around whatever it is that we're aware of. But at the same time, it's not something that is intrinsically incapable of being made explicit. It's just that it's not explicit now or not explicit in this act of mental awareness. So you always can, and sometimes it might be difficult, or it might you might have to sort of train yourself to do it, etc. But you always can, in principle, take anything that is currently part of that implicit background and make it into like an explicit foreground. But by doing that, you are pushing something else into the background. So it's not possible to have like an awareness that would be fully foreground and fully explicit, as opposed to this contrast between the implicit and explicit.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that like that section we were discussing a couple of sessions ago when he was talking about these kind of instantaneous perceptions before, like when you perceive that, like see somebody's apartment and sort of get an immediate sense for the kind of personality they have. My sense is that for Merleau-Ponty, there's something that is kind of lost in the passage to thematization, but I don't know. Yeah, this is just something that I'm interested to see how this plays out kind of over the course of his thought.
Yes, I think you're right that there is something lost in the sense that like if we go back to that example of the melody, obviously, buying the score of a symphony and sitting there and poring over the pages is not exactly as interesting an experience as actually listening to the symphony. Maybe some people who are like expert musicians might be able to just look at the score and like have some sort of appreciation or like be able to sort of picture picture is the wrong word, but sort of play the score in their minds without even sitting down at a piano or an instrument and actually playing it out loud. So they might be able to get a grasp of the symphony just by reading the score. But for most of us, even if you are like someone who does know how to read music, just looking at a score on the page is not going to produce the same kind of aesthetic experience as actually listening to the symphony. And likewise, if you like, the contrast case that I presented was like, the pattern that makes up a friendship. If you could like, analyze your friendship and like, sort of break it down into all the different, situations that you interact with each other and what kinds of behavior each of you does, etc., and like formulate it into this like, I don't know, thousands of pages long manual of like how to be friends with X. Like this manual, obviously, like reading this manual would obviously not be anything like the experience of actually engaging in that friendship and being friends with this person. So this sort of like representation or this like making explicit of a pattern of behavior has a certain like I don't know, a dead quality, or it's like it doesn't have that same like vitality and force and energy or whatever you want to call it that the actual experience itself has. It's like yeah, it's just sort of at a remove from the experience of the friendship itself. And yeah, in the same way that a musical score is sort of like a static representation of something that is itself dynamic and has that kind of vitality to it. So I think in any of these cases where we make something explicit, we're sort of like freezing it for to make it something that we can present to ourselves and be aware of, and we can use it to say make decisions or to adapt our behavior to a new situation and so on. But at the same time, we sort of lose that dynamic, vital immersion or engagement with whatever structure it is that we're making explicit to ourselves in that way. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit. Bats, would you like to read? I think yeah, we're at page 181.
Okay, are we in but?
Yes, I think yeah, but as we have seen, yeah.
Okay, nice. But as we have seen, biology already refers to the phenomenal body, that is, to the center of vital actions which are extended over a segment of time, respond to certain concrete stimulus, goals, and affect the collaboration of the whole organism. These modes of behavior do not even subsist as such in man, reorganize in its turn in new wholes. Vital behavior as such disappears. This is what is signified, for example, by the periodicity of and monotony of sexual life in animals, by its constancy and its variation in man. Thus, one cannot speak of the body and of life in general, but only of the animal body and animal life, of the human body and human life, and the body of the normal subject, if it is not detached from the spatio-temporal cycles of behavior of which it is the support, is not distinct from the psychological. Remarks of the same kind would be possible concerning the notion of mind. We are not defending a mentalism which would distinguish mind and life which would distinguish mind and life, or mind and the psychological, as two quote-unquote powers of being. It is a question of quote-unquote functional opposition, which cannot be transformed into a quote-unquote substantial opposition. Mind is not a specific difference, which would be added to vital or psychological being in order to constitute a man. Man is not a rational animal. The appearance of reason and mind does not leave intact a sphere of self-enclosed instincts in man. Cognitive disorders which affect the categorial attitude are expressed by a loss of sexual initiative. The alteration of higher functions reaches as far as the so-called instinctive structures. The ablation of the higher centers entails death, although the cerebrate animals can subsist after a fashion. Open quotes. If man had the senses of an animal, he would not have reason. End quotes. Man can never be an animal. His life is always more or less integrated than that of an animal. But if the alleged instincts of man do not exist apart from the mental dialectic, correlatively, this dialectic is not conceivable outside of the concrete situations in which it is embodied. One does not act with mind alone. Either mind is nothing, or it constitutes a real and not an ideal transformation of man. Because it is not a new sort of being, but a new form of unity, it cannot stand by itself. What is artificial in the alternatives of psychology can be seen from the point of view which we have adopted. After the psychology as a science of the facts of consciousness has come the psychology without consciousness of Watson. But it is not realized that a partitive analysis, which decomposes behavior into reflexes and conditioned reflexes, does not succeed in furnishing laws of natural behavior. Therefore, it is said, quote-unquote determinants or quote-unquote functional variables must be introduced as conditions of behavior in addition to the quote-unquote stimuli, which variables confer a value and a meaning to on the stimuli. But no more in Tolman than in his critique is the philosophical status of the determinants ever correctly conceptualized. They are compared to the ideal components of the phenomena which physics formulates, and it is added that, being abstractions like speed, output, and energy, they should no more be considered real than these latter. But while the ideal variables of science constitute reality itself for it, Psychologists conserve the realistic distinction of causes and conditions, open quote. Only stimuli and responses are realities. The determinants of behavior, that is, the mental phenomena, are only traits or relations between traits and phases of behavior, end quote. Thus, quote unquote, purposive behaviorism remains quote unquote materialistic and tries to gain acceptance only for the rights of a description of behavior which does not divide it into atoms, does not reduce it to physiological terms, but considers it quote unquote in its unity and originality. But either the determinants which the description introduces admit somatic equivalent, and then the description spoken of has only a provisional value, and there is nothing essential to be changed in physiological behaviorism, whose inadequacy is nevertheless recognized, or else these determinants are irreducible, and then it is asserted they bring back finalism. Thus, one does not escape from the classical debate between quote-unquote mentalist and quote-unquote materialist. The negation of materialistic realism seems possible only to the benefit of mentalistic realism, and conversely, it is not seen that from the moment behavior is considered quote-unquote in its unity and in its human meaning, one is no longer dealing with a material reality, nor, moreover, with a mental reality, but with a significative whole, or a structure which properly belongs neither to the external world nor to internal life. It is realism in general which must be called into question. I can keep going if you want, or maybe we can stop here.
I think you can keep going a little bit. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I just read that we already read. Okay, I'm gonna keep going for a bit then. The obscurity comes from the old antithesis between external and internal perception, and from the privilege generally accorded the latter. But it is a fact that it was possible to constitute a psychology which owes nothing to introspection. A purely objective method can delineate the structure of the universe of quote-unquote colors in butterflies by comparing the reactions which are evoked in them by the different colored stimuli, precisely on the condition of limiting oneself strictly to the identity or difference of the responses in the presence of such and such given stimuli, and of not projecting our lived experience of colors into the consciousness of the butterfly. There is an objective analysis and an objective definition of perception, intelligence, and emotion as structures of behavior, and we have attempted a description of this kind in the preceding chapter. The mental, thus understood, is comprehensible from the outside. Even more, introspection itself is a procedure of knowledge, which is homogeneous with external observation. For what it gives us as soon as it is communicated is not the lived experience itself, but an account in which language plays the role of a general preparation, acquired once and for all, which does not differ essentially from the preparation of the circumstances employed by the objective method. The child who is supposed to say which colors appear similar to him, and the monkey which has been trained to put all the slugs of the same color in a saucer are in the same situation. Nothing is changed when the subject is charged with interpreting his reactions in himself, which is what is proper to introspection. When he is asked if he can read the letters inscribed on a panel or distinguish the details of a shape, he will not trust a vague, quote-unquote, impression of legibility. He will attempt to read or describe what is presented to him. Open quote. Introspection, as soon as it is translated into language, affirms something completely other than the existence of certain inner qualities. The state of consciousness is the consciousness of a state. Consciousness is always consciousness of something. Consciousness of ... consciousness that ... that is, of a function ... These functions are part of the real. The consciousness which we have of them can be correct or incorrect, end quote. The object, which is intended by both external observation and introspection, is then a structure of or a signification which is reached in both cases through different materials. Okay, I think this is maybe a good place to stop because I have some questions.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
I gotta think a bit. Give me a second. Let me think a bit about
Yeah,
this.
no worries. No rush. Sorry, let me go back a little bit. Sorry, I'm just trying to find where was that bit? Right, yeah, so yeah, he's sort of recapitulating here his criticisms that we saw in chapter 2 of the sort of attempts to supplement the reflex theory with some account of like a sort of cognitive processing that, like, there would be these sort of, instead of just having these simple stimulus response loops or circuits or whatever, you would like sort of stick a bit of processing in between the stimulus and the response. So like different stimuli would be compared with each other or joined together or whatever. Something would happen to these stimuli in the processing center, and then the response would be generated and sent out to the effector organs from there. And so as we saw in chapter 2, Merleau-Ponty doesn't see this as like a really much of an improvement on the reflex theory. It sort of it just sort of like it accepts most of the presuppositions of the reflex theory and just sort of sticks an extra bit of computation or processing or whatever on top of the simple sort of reflex circuit. So yeah, it doesn't really get us any further. And so he thinks, of course, that we have to move away from this whole picture of a stimulus. Like there isn't really such a thing as this sort of atomic stimulus that would then secondarily be connected to other stimuli and processed in various ways, and then bring about a reaction, a response of some kind. So what he's talking about here, this kind of what he's describing as this purposive behaviorism. I guess that he's citing someone who uses that term for themselves. He thinks this is like not a real alternative to behaviorism or to a stimulus response theory. So like, and I think he would make a similar type of analysis of like the more I guess sophisticated, or like the way that there was a sort of return of acceptability of this kind of cognitive side of mental life in psychology in this, maybe like the post-World War II era, where people after sort of some of the difficulties that behaviorism ended up in, were more willing to talk about mental structures and cognitive structures and so on. The idea that there is something going on in the mind that is not just this conditioning of responses based on different stimuli. Like this is sort of like the mainstream of psychology in the post World War II era that makes room for something like cognition as a process that sort of governs the relationship between stimuli and responses. But I think that whole approach would sort of fall under the same criticism that Merleau-Ponty has given of the idea of sort of adding this like processing block or module or whatever on top of the existing stimulus response circuits.
To go back to something that from the beginning of what Bats read on 181, I find this idea very interesting and compelling that in the human being you don't have, like, you're not stacking layers of these functions, like vital functions, on top of which mental or symbolic functions would then be added. So you have kind of pure vital function and then symbolic function on top. But he talks about, and he's mentioned this before, that for Schneider, the loss of what he calls here the categorial attitude is accompanied by loss of sexual initiatives, which is not what you would expect to happen if there were, independent, kind of non categorially related sexual instincts at work in the human being. But if this, I think it's just summarized nicely in that quote, that if man had the senses of an animal, he wouldn't have reason. So, it's, again, we don't have the senses of an animal underneath thought. If we did, there would be no reason to have thought in the first place, because we would be perfectly adequate to the world, in the way that a cat is adequate to catching mice. The point about introspection, I don't fully understand what he's saying here, but the comparison of preparing this experimental setup for a monkey with different colored slugs that it has to sort by color is compared to basically training a child to speak. Thinking of this in terms of what Nan, you were talking about at the beginning of the session with the difference between the human and the animal and self-awareness. It's like it's almost like he's saying that introspection is like a kind of behaviorist self-observation. I don't know, something that is also made possible by symbolic life. Kind of reminds me, I haven't read about it in a while now, but it kind of reminds me of like the myth of Jones and the idea that you know introspecting like inner episodes is something that people learn to do. You know, something capacity that had to be prepared in some way.
Yeah, I think the idea, yeah, so like he's sort of criticizing this sort of traditional opposition in terms of methodology in psychology, that like, is it the case that you should allow for introspection as a source of mathematical knowledge, or should you limit yourself to external behavior in the way that the behaviorists had proposed? And he is suggesting here this is kind of a false opposition, because introspection is itself a kind of perception, in the same way it's not sort of intrinsically different from external perception. Like when, so for example, that if we go back to the example of the relationship with your friend, of course there's like a sort of inner experience of what it's like to be a friend, and what kinds of emotional responses you have to this person, and their behavior and so on. But that inner experience doesn't constitute the friendship as such. Like if you just sort of sit in your apartment and have this inner experience of like emotional attachment to a person, that doesn't mean you're actually friends with them, as many desperate fans of celebrities learn to their dismay. Um, so like, yeah, this kind of inner experience is one aspect of the mental life and behavior. This whole sort of melodic structure that makes up the friendship. So yeah, it's not that this inner experience doesn't exist, or that it's like not important or relevant, but it also is not. It doesn't sort of present this melodic structure in its entirety. It doesn't make it entirely explicit in the way that some of the sort of introspectionist psychology sort of assumed, that you could like just sort of read off from introspection, the nature of mental life and the structure and so on. So yeah, it's a kind of relativization of the value of introspection, that it doesn't sort of give us this like transparent or immediate access to the structure of this melodic pattern, or anything like that. But it also is not like sort of negligible, or like sometimes some behaviorists would talk about it as like sort of an epiphenomenon. It's just like a little movie that accompanies the real the real important part, which is the behavior that is externally observable. And of course that's like not at all what Merleau-Ponty wants to talk about here. Bats, would you want to talk about your comment here in the chat over voice, and we can discuss it?
Yeah, sure. I'm just like not entirely sure if I'm getting right if I'm understanding right the paragraph, but I commented that the idea in what I read that I find the most interesting is the concept of a functional opposition, which he contrasts with a substantial one. Here I take it in the whole like mental versus real discussion, or he's talking about that in general. So he, as I understand, what he proposes is this concept of a functional opposition that can circumvent the issues, I guess, that appear in the realism versus mentalism. I don't know exactly how he calls it, but the realism about the mental, I guess, materialism. And I guess if I understand it properly, the way it's different is that it goes beyond the old duality, since the objective is found in the functional structures, which by virtue of being a structure, implicitly, well, they imply that they have a meaning to humans in themselves, or some part of implicit meaning. But I'm not sure. It's a bit hard for me to understand this.
Yeah, I think this is connected. This is something that I was actually talking with a friend who is a neuroscientist about this, like I don't know, a few weeks ago, or something related to this. Um, so yeah, everyone is familiar with the placebo effect, which is used in or is like a concept that is part of the whole process of testing medication, where if like say it's a pain medication. When they're studying, is this medication something that we can approve and like that companies can sell as pain medication? You divide up the subjects in the test, and you give some of them the real medication, and some of them you give like a pill, a sugar pill, or something that has no medical effect, but looks the same as the pill that you're trying to evaluate. And the people who get even the sugar pill that has no sort of pharmaceutical properties often will report that their symptoms improve, that they feel less pain, that they're more able to engage in their daily activities and so on. And then of course the sort of standard of like is this pain medication effective is whether it performs better than the placebo. So do the people who get the real medication report more improvement of symptoms than the people that get the sugar pill. And I think like sort of the general conception of the placebo effect is that it's a kind of like illusion or something like that. That it's people just think that their symptoms are better or whatever. But especially in the case of pain medication or pain experience, it's hard to understand what exactly it would mean to say that like it's an illusion that your pain is better, that like really your pain is the same, but you just think it's better or something like that. Like, what does that even mean? So like the placebo effect is like a real effect. Like you really do experience less pain after taking a sugar pill. Even though the mechanism of this effect is obviously not a sort of pharmaceutical mechanism, but it has to do with the fact that yeah, I was going to mention that, yeah, right after, yeah. So there's this even weirder aspect, which has only, I think, in the last like 10 years or so been studied, which is this whole concept of an open placebo or an honest placebo. So there've been, yeah, a few studies where they not only give people like a treatment that has no pharmaceutical effect, a pill or an injection or whatever, but they explicitly tell the person that it has no pharmaceutical effect. So like they'll say like, I'm giving you a placebo pill right now. This has no medical or pharmaceutical effect on your body, but I want you to take this pill. And then the people that have like I think one study was like chronic back pain or something like that, and people one group of people took the open placebo pill that they knew had fully explained to them was not did not contain any medically active ingredients over the course of I think like a couple months, and then the other group of people had no treat or just continued with whatever forms of treatment that they had used before, massage or whatever. And the people that were taking this open placebo actually did show a certain diminution of symptoms, less pain experience, more ability to engage in daily activities and so on, compared to the people that did not take this open placebo. So it's not just that you are sort of tricked into having this improvement in your symptoms, but somehow even when you're fully aware that you are taking something that had no pharmaceutical effect on your body, you were still just the act of taking that pill or being involved in this study or whatever exactly it was, somehow this had an effect of easing the person's symptoms, which is pretty surprising and very strange and quite interesting, I think, because yeah, so like this idea that like and I think in general there's this sort of idea that the psychosomatic effects, whether it's the placebo effect or in other cases people have they'll go to the doctor and report like chronic pain or fatigue or whatever, and the doctor can't find any physical explanation for why the person would have this pain or fatigue, and then they say, oh, it's psychosomatic. And the sort of a lot of doctors and a lot of patients as well will understand that to mean, oh, it's not real, it's like it's just in your head or something like that. But like that's exactly what pain is, of course, is this experience like it's intrinsically a subjective experience. So like whether the pain is caused by some sort of disease or injury, or it's caused by some sort of psychological process, you're still experiencing the pain. So it's just as real, no matter what the cause is. And then on the other side, if whether the treatment that eases the pain is brought about through some chemical interaction from a pill that has some sort of drug, some sort of medically active substance in it, or it's caused by some psychological process having to do with this whole situation or experience of taking a pill, even when it's just a sugar pill. Either way, you're still reducing the experience of pain, and that's like what pain actually is. So you're still it's a real effect in the sense that it really does reduce your pain. So yeah, I think this sort of general opposition, this like real versus ideal, or this like somatic versus psychological distinction. It's just like especially in the case of pain, it sort of leads to these like conceptual confusions that it doesn't really make sense to say that like, oh, your pain is actually still there, you just think it's not there, or like you don't notice it, or whatever. So it's I think this kind of the whole placebo effect, and then especially these open placebos point towards the need to sort of reconceptualize a lot of these categories that are like sort of presupposed in medical practice and and even our like daily lives. Yeah, and I think so Bats has put a question here in the chat about like how this would connect with Ponty's concepts that he's developing here. I think his sort of general the things that he's been saying in the last couple of paragraphs about how like it's not the case that you can sort of split up human behavior into like this corporeal vital set of instincts or drives or whatever, and then like add a rational mind on top of it, or a mental life on top of it. You have to see like the entirety of human existence as sort of permeated by this symbolic order of reality. So even like things that are in some sense somatic, like the experience of pain, are also permeated by this like symbolic order of like the representation of like a pill as something that eases pain, or produces medical effects or whatever. That somehow this understanding of that a pill as something that would be effective in treating my pain symptoms actually brings about a treatment of the pain symptoms, even in the case where you are fully aware that the pill does not have any pharmaceutical properties. It's an interesting question that Angus has put in the chat here. Would these placebos work on Schneider, the patient that Goldstein worked with? So I've actually, I don't know if there's been any study on like how like what are the differences between people in terms of how effective placebos are, and maybe different types of placebos are effective on different people. I don't know if there's been really any study on that, because I think it's only fairly recently that the like placebos as such have been an object of study, whereas before they were just sort of like the reference case that you would use to compare the efficacy of other treatments. But yeah, I think it's at least conceivable that people who have certain types of brain damage might maybe not be as susceptible to placebo effects, or they would experience different kinds of placebo effects, or different types of placebo treatments would have different effects on them, etc. So yeah, it would be a very interesting sort of fields to look into, to try to study what is the relationship between like different kinds of brain damage and different placebo effects. Yeah, exactly. We have a whole research program that we've developed over the last 20 minutes or so. We just need to get someone to give us like a couple $100,000 in grants, and we'll set up our lab, and and we're all good.
I can't remember who read last, but I can. Oh wait, where are we? We read before the conclusion.
Yeah, that's the read last. Where did you end? Are we right before the conclusion?
Oh yeah, I actually hadn't noticed. I would have finished if I had noticed. It's the very end of.
I think we stopped like one paragraph before the conclusion.
183.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I can
maybe you can read from like that one paragraph and then read the conclusion. It's just one page.
Yeah. No problem. Okay. There is no reason either to reject introspection or to make it the privileged means of access to a world of psychological facts. It is one of the possible perspectives of the structure and immanent meaning of conduct, which latter constitute the only psychological quote-unquote reality. Conclusion to chapter 3. In the preceding chapters, we have considered the birth of behavior in the physical world and in an organism. That is, we have pretended to know nothing of man by reflection and have limited ourselves to developing what was implied in the scientific representation of his behavior. Aided by the notion of structure or form, we have arrived at the conclusion that both mechanism and finalism should be rejected, and that the quote-unquote physical, the quote-unquote vital, and the quote-unquote mental do not represent three powers of being, but three dialectics. Physical nature in man is not subordinated to a vital principle. The organism does not conspire to actualize an idea, and the mental is not a motor principle in the body. But what we call nature is already consciousness of nature. What we call life is already consciousness of life, and what we call mental is still an object vis-a-vis consciousness. Nevertheless, while establishing the ideality of the physical form, that of the organism, and that of the quote-unquote mental, and precisely because we did it, we could not simply superimpose these three orders. Not being a new substance, each of them had to be conceived as a retaking and a quote-unquote new structuration of the preceding one. From this comes the double aspect of the analysis, with which both liberated the higher from the lower and founded the former on the latter. It is this double relation which remains obscure, and which now induces us to situate our results with respect to the classical solutions, and in particular with respect to critical idealism. At the beginning, we considered consciousness as a region of being, and as a particular type of behavior. Upon analysis, one finds it presupposed everywhere as the place of ideas, and everywhere interconnected as the integration of existence. What then is the relation between consciousness as universal milieu and consciousness enrooted in the subordinated dialectics? Must the point of view of the quote-unquote outside spectator be abandoned as illegitimate to the benefit of an unconditioned reflection? Yeah, so this is obviously a pretty brief summary of the movement of chapter 3. These different orders are, as he put it at one point, they're phenomena, which is how we got around the dialectic in the bad sense of, for instance, law and structure in the physical order, and yet they are distinct as phenomena. And so in order to understand them, we had to understand them as having this relation of, I guess, dialectical inclusion or subordination. But then the question seems to be, so this is obviously a phenomenological position. Maybe you could argue that at this point, at least, someone might argue that it is idealist, or there's something idealist about it. Because I do think that he is saying that consciousness is universal milieu. And so now the question, which is obviously left unanswered, is, if we have to understand consciousness, or if we can only understand consciousness in relation to its subordinated dialectics, then how do we reconcile that with the idea that it's a universal milieu in which these dialectics themselves appear as phenomena?
Yeah, he sort of alluded to some of these questions earlier in the book, where he talked about how what he thinks is sort of a limitation of the philosophical interpretation that the Gestalt psychologists had proposed of their own accounts of form, in the sense that he thinks they didn't make use of the notion of form itself to understand the relation between this human order and the vital order, and then the physical order as well. So he thinks we need to use this notion of form not just within the human order or the vital order, but sort of outside to to understand the relationship between these different orders. So we can't think of them as these sort of self-contained wholes that are then sort of connected externally to each other. We have to understand their sort of interpenetration, interrelationship, this dialectical whatever exactly that means here, this connection between these different orders. Yeah, so that's sort of the problem that he's setting himself in this fourth part of the book. And then especially there's this, so throughout this part of the book, and as we've sort of been building up to this, this notion of the human order, he's been sort of showing the inadequacy of this external observer perspective in in the case of the human level, the human order. If you reduce your friendship, to come back to the same example, like to I don't know, a description of all the actions that you engage in the presence of this other person. Lifted your hand at 17:05 hours and whatever. All these different sort of minute descriptions of external behavior don't sort of capture what it is to be friends. But then like the sort of question that brings about is, is there some sort of illegitimacy of this external observer perspective in the case of human behavior? Should we abandon this kind of external description altogether? And so that's part of what he's going to discuss in the next chapter, the next part of the book. And I don't remember like his exact answer, but I think it's not too much of a spoiler to say that his answer is going to be not quite. It's more complicated than that, which is usually his answer to everything. So we'll see exactly how that plays out in the next section. Okay, so yeah, we're at this chapter break, so I would suggest that we stop here for today, and we can pick up on at the beginning of chapter 4 next time, if that works for everyone.
That sounds good to me. Out of curiosity, have you ever read any Gurwitch? I have not read it,
no.
but I was reading about Merleau-Ponty's relation to Gurwitch the other day, and apparently they were pretty close, and he kind of introduced him to a lot of these Gestaltist criticisms of behaviorism. Although I think that they end up taking Gestaltism in different directions, but I'm not exactly sure what Gurwich's position is. It'd be interesting to read a bit about him at some point.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that a bit. I don't really know anything about his work. Cool. Okay. So thanks everyone for coming out and for your contributions. And hope to see you next week.